The void of space had never seemed so empty, so heavy as the fleets of the Imperium approached the shattered world below. Smoke and fire coiled across the surface like serpents, devouring the remnants of cities that had once thrived under the Emperor's guidance. Guilliman descended in his battle barge, the golden light of his armor reflecting off the charred hulls of ships drifting in orbit. The cries of the dying reached him even through layers of reinforced ceramite, an endless symphony of despair that gnawed at the edge of his consciousness. Each world he saved carried the mark of destruction, a reminder that salvation often demanded sacrifices too great to measure. The screams of the populace, the groans of collapsing structures, and the shriek of shattered engines combined into a grim chorus that seemed to mock the very notion of victory. Guilliman's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword as he stared at the surface, knowing that the Imperium he had returned to protect was fraying at the edges faster than any enemy could have hoped to accomplish. The ground shook as artillery erupted across the ruins, and the distant roar of engines signaled that enemy forces were not yet vanquished. Guilliman's mind raced, analyzing the battle lines, the depleted regiments, and the civilians trapped between the walls of fire. His eyes, hardened by centuries of war, were not drawn to strategy alone, but to the human cost of each decision he made. The Imperium had survived, but its survival was a tapestry stitched with blood and terror. Somewhere amidst the chaos, whispers of rebellion and treachery lingered, carried on the wind or the faint vibrations of shattered communications. Every command Guilliman gave could save lives or doom them, and every victory felt tainted by the lives lost in the process. Fear was no stranger to him, yet even he could not ignore the creeping dread that perhaps the Imperium he had fought to restore was no longer a force he could fully control. A sudden explosion rocked the perimeter, throwing Guilliman to the deck and sending shards of ceramite clattering across the floor. His servitors scrambled to contain the damage, but the shock was a reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest forces. From orbit, his sensors detected anomalies, fleets moving in ways that contradicted protocol, signals from systems that should have been loyal, and hints of unseen threats lying in ambush. The Imperium was alive, but in its veins ran chaos, corruption, and ambition that no single Primarch could contain. Even the staunchest commanders bent under the weight of politics, fear, and superstition, and Guilliman realized that the galaxy he had fought to preserve might now become a cage for his own conscience. The terror of this realization settled on him like a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, heavier than any armor, colder than any void. Through the viewport, Guilliman saw the flickering glow of a cathedral burning, a monument to faith reduced to ash in moments. The scene was both beautiful and horrifying, a testament to human resilience and human folly intertwined. His fleet moved to respond to scattered calls for aid, but every step forward seemed to reveal another layer of decay, another fracture in the foundation of the Imperium. He had returned to a galaxy that required salvation, yet every act of heroism seemed to deepen the shadow that threatened to consume it. As he prepared to engage the enemy, a thought rooted itself deep in his mind, chilling and undeniable. The Imperium he had fought to restore was no longer a kingdom he ruled, but a beast that could turn on him at any moment. The fear that gripped Guilliman was not of defeat alone, but of the weight of what he had saved, an empire so vast, so unyielding, and so unknowable that even its savior might tremble before it.
Guilliman's footsteps echoed through the hollow corridors of the ruined city, each sound swallowed by the silence of devastation. The streets were littered with debris, scorched remnants of buildings, and the bodies of both imperial citizens and enemy combatants alike. Smoke rose in thick black columns from shattered industrial complexes, and the stench of burning flesh and ozone clung to the air like a suffocating fog. He walked with deliberate pace, every movement measured, every gaze calculating. Even after centuries, the sight of human suffering struck him with a force that no tactical brilliance could dull. The Imperium was alive, but it was fragile, fractured by war and by the inefficiency and corruption that had persisted even under his watchful eye. Guilliman had returned to bring order, to save humanity from annihilation, yet each step through the ruins reminded him that salvation had a cost far greater than he had anticipated. The city, once a beacon of imperial might, now seemed to whisper accusations at him, questioning whether his return had merely delayed inevitable collapse. As he moved deeper into the city, Guilliman observed the survivors cowering in shadowed alcoves, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear, and voices trembling with a mixture of relief and terror. Children clutched to the corpses of parents, families huddled together in ruined homes, and soldiers knelt over the dying or the dead, unsure if their loyalty was enough to justify survival. Guilliman's presence, once a symbol of hope, seemed to carry a weight of expectation that no one could bear. Each survivor he passed looked to him not as a savior, but as a sentinel, tasked with protecting them from a reality that was unendingly cruel. The enormity of this responsibility pressed upon him like a physical weight, and he found himself questioning whether the Imperium he had restored was capable of sustaining the fragile lives that clung to it. Every order he had given, every decision he had enacted, now reverberated with consequences that no strategy could fully anticipate. In the silence between the echoes of explosions and distant gunfire, Guilliman realized that the cost of salvation was more than measured in battle victories. It was measured in the fear and suffering of those he had pledged to protect. The ruined streets were punctuated by sporadic skirmishes, remnants of enemy forces attempting to strike at the heart of the city before Imperial reinforcements could stabilize the perimeter. Guilliman watched as squads of Imperial guardsmen engaged in desperate firefights, their ammunition dwindling, their morale tested by the sheer relentlessness of the assault. He could see the fear in their eyes mirrored in his own, a reflection of the impossible expectations placed upon human soldiers in a war they could not hope to fully comprehend. Orders were relayed with mechanical precision, yet even the most coordinated movements seemed insufficient against the tide of violence that battered them. Guilliman's tactical mind catalogued every threat, every opportunity, and every possible outcome, but even his calculations revealed an unsettling truth. The Imperium was a machine whose gears were grinding against themselves as much as against its enemies. The war was not simply against Xenos or heretics, it was against the decay that gnawed at the Imperium's soul, a decay he himself had only partially repaired. In the central square, Guilliman paused to survey the remnants of the population, a huddled mass of humanity whose faith and resilience had carried them through months of siege. Here, the consequences of his decisions were starkly visible. Civilians scavenging for meager rations, families forced to rely on rationed water, and wounded soldiers dragging themselves through rubble with the last threads of life clinging to them. Guilliman's mind, usually focused on grand strategy and long-term campaigns, found itself grappling with the immediate and raw reality of human suffering. Each life was a thread in the tapestry of the Imperium, and he felt the weight of each one as a burden upon his soul. To save the Imperium was not merely to win battles or crush enemies, it was to navigate an ethical labyrinth where every choice was both necessary and catastrophic. The city had survived, but at what cost? The question echoed in Guilliman's mind, as relentless and unforgiving as the artillery fire that still shook the foundations of the surrounding structures.
Amidst the ruins, Guilliman encountered a contingent of tech priests, their augmatic limbs whirring and glowing with strange lights, attempting to restore failing machinery and maintain the fragile infrastructure that still functioned. Their presence was a reminder that the Imperium was more than its soldiers. It was a complex organism of faith, science, and administration, all interdependent and all vulnerable. Guilliman observed the priests as they worked, noting the meticulous precision of their efforts, the quiet despair etched into their faces. Even these custodians of knowledge and technology, who should have been immune to fear, bore the mark of exhaustion and doubt. Their efforts, like his own, were heroic, yet insufficient, and Guilliman understood that the Imperium's survival was a constant balancing act against entropy, corruption, and human failure. In this delicate equilibrium, even a small misstep could unleash catastrophe, and the knowledge that he alone could not guarantee stability gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. As the day wore on, Guilliman moved toward the remnants of the city's command center, a place where communications, strategy, and leadership were meant to converge in unity. Here, the full scope of the Imperium's fragility became apparent. Reports of rebellion, sabotage, and dissent reached him faster than he could respond, each message a testament to the inefficiency and inherent instability of the systems he had sought to repair. The bureaucrats and officers who should have been his allies were, in many cases, obstacles, motivated by fear, ambition, or superstition. Guilliman felt the weight of centuries of accumulated failure pressing down on him, a reminder that no amount of strength or wisdom could fully reconcile the Imperium's contradictions. Even in victory there was no peace, only a temporary reprieve from chaos, and the knowledge that every moment of calm was a prelude to another storm. In that command center, surrounded by the whir of machines and the desperate pleas of those under his protection, Guilliman confronted the reality of what it meant to save the Imperium, that salvation was never absolute, and that fear, both his and theirs, would always linger. The afternoon bled into evening, and the shadows of the ruined city lengthened, darkening streets already filled with despair. Guilliman moved through the alleys with a measured pace, his mind a battlefield as much as the streets themselves. Every decision, every tactical maneuver carried the weight of lives and futures he could not fully control. The Imperium, vast and sprawling, was a machine of unimaginable complexity, and his return, though heroic, had placed him at the center of forces that no single being could dominate. As the sun set behind the smoking horizon, he paused atop a crumbling observation tower, overlooking the remnants of the city. From this vantage, the scale of both his triumph and his failure was undeniable. The Imperium lived because of him, yet it existed in a state that could terrify even a Primarch. The realization struck him with a clarity that was chilling and inescapable. To save the Imperium was to bear a weight heavier than any armor, to command a machine that could crush or betray him, and to face the knowledge that even victory was inseparable from suffering. Night fell over the city, blanketing the ruins in darkness punctuated by distant fires and the faint glimmer of defensive turrets still holding against intermittent attacks. Guilliman remained atop the observation tower, watching over the survivors, soldiers, and remaining defenders as they struggled against forces both external and internal. In the quiet moments, he reflected on the paradox of his existence. The Imperium was his responsibility, yet it was also a source of terror. Every victory he achieved brought new challenges, new crises, and new moral dilemmas, and he understood that the galaxy he had saved was no longer a realm of certainty or order. It was a living, breathing entity of chaos and devotion, of hope and despair, and its enormity was matched only by its unpredictability. Guilliman's fear was not the fear of death or defeat, but the fear of the Imperium itself, an empire that could no longer be guided by one hand, and that might one day consume even its greatest savior.
Guilliman's arrival at the Imperial Command Center revealed a deeper rot than even the battlefields could show. The walls, carved with the proud sigils of the Emperor, now seemed hollow, echoing with whispers that were both literal and figurative. Servitors moved mechanically through corridors, their augmetic limbs casting long, flickering shadows across cracked ceramite flooring. As he walked, Guilliman's eyes scanned the faces of those who should have been his allies, high lords, adeptus administratum officials, and representatives of the Inquisition.
Each looked at him with a mixture of respect, fear, and veiled calculation, and he could feel the weight of their unspoken agendas pressing against him. Even in a place designed for unity and order, Guilliman sensed fracture lines running deep into the core of the Imperium. Every nod of assent, every hesitant bow, carried the faint tremor of self-interest, and he realized that the enemies he had fought on battlefields were only half of the threats he now faced. Reports poured in, each one a testament to the complex and often contradictory machinery of the Imperium. Systems that should have been loyal were failing, entire fleets unaccounted for, and intelligence suggested that factions within his own command were undermining his strategies. Guilliman listened carefully, processing each piece of information with a tactical mind honed over centuries, yet even his calculations could not provide clarity in the fog of deception. The whispers of rebellion, subtle acts of sabotage, and inexplicable failures were more than mere mistakes. They were symptoms of a deeper disease. For every battle he had won, every world he had saved, there seemed to be a shadow waiting to undo his efforts. The Imperium, vast and sprawling, was no longer a machine under his guidance. It had become a living entity with hidden veins of corruption, ambition, and fear that pulsed against his will. The fear that gripped him was no longer the fear of loss alone. It was the fear of the very system he had fought to restore, a system whose intentions might not align with his own. As he moved into the chambers of the High Lords, Guilliman observed the intricate dance of politics and power that had persisted through centuries. Discussions were hushed, filled with loaded glances and punctuated by subtle gestures that conveyed as much meaning as words. One lord, a stern man with gaunt features and a reputation for cunning, leaned forward to speak in cryptic terms about necessary sacrifices and stability at any cost. Guilliman's gaze narrowed. He knew that beneath the surface of their polite discourse lay ambition, fear, and perhaps even malice. Every word was chosen to conceal intent, every proposal a test of loyalty. The realization was chilling. He had returned to a galaxy that required salvation, yet the very people entrusted with its governance might undermine it for personal gain. Guilliman understood that while he could command armies, fleets, and strategy, he could not command the hearts of men who acted in secrecy, motivated by motives that he could not fully comprehend or control. Through whispered corridors and private chambers, Guilliman encountered signs of heresy and corruption that defied his understanding. Symbols, subtle and carefully hidden, marked the private quarters of individuals whose loyalty should have been unquestioned. He caught fragments of conversations suggesting alliances with forces long thought suppressed, and his heart sank at the implications. The Imperium was alive, yet in its veins ran a dangerous mixture of ambition, fear, and corruption, and even the smallest breach could ignite a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Guilliman realized that the battles he fought on the field were mere prelude. The true war was within the Imperium itself, fought in shadows, whispers, and subterfuge. The weight of this revelation pressed down upon him heavier than any warhammer or power sword, for it revealed that the empire he had saved might not survive its own people's ambitions or betrayals. An aide approached Guilliman, whispering of a recent assassination attempt on a key planetary governor, a loyalist whose death could destabilize an entire sector. Guilliman's mind raced as he pieced together the implications. Plots were being woven not by Xenos, not by chaos, but by men and women within the Imperium, whose motivations were as obscure as they were dangerous. The fear he felt was not abstract, it was visceral, a tangible presence that wrapped around him as tightly as his armor. The Imperium he had rebuilt was fragile, and its fragility stemmed not from external enemies, but from the very human flaws he had sought to mitigate. Every decision he made carried risk, every delay could cost thousands of lives, and every act of mercy or restraint might be interpreted as weakness by those who sought to seize power. Guilliman understood that the battlefields were no longer the sole measure of success. The shadows of politics and corruption were now equally lethal. As night fell across the command center, Guilliman found himself alone in a quiet observation chamber, looking down at the lights of the cities under Imperial control. From above, the Imperium seemed ordered, stable, and unwavering, but he knew the reality was far different. Beneath the surface, networks of loyalty and treachery intertwined, creating a web so intricate that even a Primarch could not fully untangle it. His mind traced the possibilities, the alliances, and the betrayals that could erupt at any moment, each one capable of undoing the work of centuries. The weight of responsibility, already immense, had grown heavier. Every world he had saved was a potential flashpoint, every fleet under his command a fragile chain of obedience, and every official a possible threat. Guilliman understood that his fear was justified. The Imperium, in all its glory, was a living nightmare, capable of devouring even its savior if he misstepped. In the corridors below, whispers of rebellion grew louder. Subtle messages coded into bureaucratic reports, intercepted communications, and rumors that spread faster than he could verify. Guilliman's tactical mind calculated probabilities, strategies, and contingencies, yet the variables multiplied faster than he could account for them. Every victory he had achieved in battle now seemed fragile in comparison to the complexity of human ambition and fear. The Imperium was vast, sprawling, and uncontrollable in ways that no weapon could solve. Its survival depended not only on strength and strategy, but on an intricate balance of fear, loyalty, and coercion, and Guilliman knew that balance could shatter at any moment. The terror that gripped him was not of defeat by enemy arms, it was the terror of power unbound, of an empire whose complexity might one day overwhelm even the most disciplined mind. In the corridors below, whispers of rebellion grew louder. Subtle messages coded into bureaucratic reports, intercepted communications, and rumors that spread faster than he could verify. Guilliman's tactical mind calculated probabilities, strategies, and contingencies, yet the variables multiplied faster than he could account for them. Every victory he had achieved in battle now seemed fragile in comparison to the complexity of human ambition and fear. The Imperium was vast, sprawling, and uncontrollable in ways that no weapon could solve. Its survival depended not only on strength and strategy, but on an intricate balance of fear, loyalty, and coercion, and Guilliman knew that balance could shatter at any moment. The terror that gripped him was not of defeat by enemy arms, it was the terror of power unbound, of an empire whose complexity might one day overwhelm even the most disciplined mind. As the hours stretched on, Guilliman called trusted aides, seeking clarity, yet each conversation revealed new layers of intrigue. One officer spoke of fleets ordered to questionable objectives, another of governors ignoring direct commands, and yet another hinted at the resurgence of a cult thought extinguished centuries ago. Every revelation chipped away at his confidence, reminding him that the Imperium was a living organism, one whose survival demanded vigilance at all times. Even his presence, meant to inspire loyalty and strength, was a fragile counterbalance against forces he could not fully see or control. The shadows within the Imperium were patient, cunning, and relentless, and Guilliman realized that the war he fought on battlefields was nothing compared to the war he faced in the corridors of power. Here he was vulnerable, even as a Primarch, for the forces arrayed against him were subtle, invisible, and infinitely more dangerous. By the time the first light of dawn touched the spires of imperial cities, Guilliman remained in the observation chamber, his thoughts heavy with dread. The Imperium, his Imperium, had survived the battles that had torn through its worlds, yet the shadow of treachery, corruption, and ambition stretched further than any enemy he had faced. Every decision, every movement carried weight beyond calculation, and every act of mercy or restraint might be interpreted as weakness by those who sought to seize power. Guilliman understood that the Imperium was no longer merely a realm to protect, it was a force that could terrify even its greatest champion. The shadows within were as dangerous as any battlefield, and the knowledge of that truth settled upon him like iron chains. In that moment, the fear that had been growing since his return crystallized. The Imperium he fought to preserve might one day rise against him, not in rebellion alone, but in the unrelenting inevitability of its own nature.
Guilliman stood alone in the dim light of his private chamber, the vast expanse of Terra stretching below him, its surface a lattice of flame, smoke, and illuminated spires. From this vantage, the Imperium seemed ordered, serene even, but he knew that such appearances were lies. Every lighted city concealed rebellion, corruption, and despair. Every orderly fleet masked the undercurrents of ambition and fear that ran through its officers and crews. He had returned to the galaxy as a savior, a Primarch whose very presence inspired hope, yet the enormity of his task pressed upon him more heavily than any armor, more tightly than any ceramite seal. The Imperium was alive, yes, but alive in a way that no single mind could fully comprehend, an organism capable of sustaining and destroying itself simultaneously. Guilliman's bays lingered on the horizon, and for the first time in centuries he felt the true weight of his role. He was a god in the eyes of humanity, yet even gods could tremble before what they had wrought. His thoughts turned inward, and he confronted the paradox that had haunted him since his return. To save the Imperium was to become a god, yet to be a god in this empire was to fear the very creation one had nurtured. He recalled battles, victories, and campaigns meticulously planned, only to see the consequences twist into forms he had never anticipated. Cities he had protected were now breeding grounds for discontent. Fleets he had commanded were undermined by those who owed allegiance not to strategy, but to ambition. Every action he had taken, every order he had issued, became a thread in a web of consequences that stretched beyond comprehension. Guilliman's mind, sharpened over centuries of war, could not contain the scope of it. The realization was suffocating. He had saved humanity, yet humanity's survival had become a labyrinth of moral compromise, ethical uncertainty, and existential peril. As the chamber's lights flickered, a vision of the Imperium in its most extreme state seized him, visions drawn from both memory and fear. He saw fleets annihilating entire worlds, citizens worshipping blindly, while infrastructure crumbled, and the warp itself bleeding subtly into reality, influencing the thoughts and actions of men who thought themselves loyal. The images were horrifying not because they were fantastical, but because they were entirely plausible. Guilliman understood that the Imperium, left to its own devices, could become both salvation and destruction in equal measure. He had not merely returned to preserve humanity, he had returned to stand vigil over a living nightmare, one that could consume not just the galaxy, but his very soul. The fear he felt was the fear of responsibility unbounded, the terror of godhood applied to an empire that could defy even its savior's will. The day's reports arrived as they always did, endless data streams and communications outlining rebellion, heresy, and unrest across countless systems. Guilliman absorbed the details with mechanical precision, but even his legendary strategic mind could not soothe the gnawing dread that each crisis was a symptom of something larger, a force inherent in the Imperium that no Primarch could completely control. Governors ignored commands, fleets deviated from orders, and religious sects acted autonomously in ways that destabilized regions, even as they claimed loyalty. The empire had grown beyond governance. It had become a self-propagating entity, and Guilliman realized with chilling clarity that his role was no longer to command it, but to shepherd it, to influence it, and to intervene when its internal chaos threatened total collapse. The weight of godhood was absolute, unrelenting, and terrifying. He descended to the streets of a recovering city to witness firsthand the implications of his visions. There, amid the ruins, he saw the consequences of his authority writ in human suffering.
Citizens worked tirelessly to rebuild, yet despair lingered, manifesting in subtle acts of defiance, whispered curses, and trembling hands. Soldiers followed orders, yet their loyalty was brittle, contingent on the presence of a godlike figure whose attention could not extend to every corner of the Imperium. Guilliman understood that leadership in this empire was not mere strategy, it was constant vigilance, an endless negotiation with morality, fear, and devotion. Each life he saved, each system he stabilized, became a testament not only to his power, but also to the tenuous nature of the peace he enforced. His terror was not born of weakness, but of understanding. The Imperium could endure, but only at the cost of perpetual sacrifice and unending oversight. A sudden alarm shattered the quiet, drawing Guilliman's attention to the immediate threat of a chaos incursion on a nearby planet. The battle was brutal, close, and unrelenting, yet it revealed the greater horror. Even victory did not grant solace. Civilians would die despite his interventions. Fleets would be scattered despite careful planning. His enemies would retreat only to return stronger. Each confrontation confirmed a terrifying truth. The Imperium, in its complexity, could never be fully secured. Every action he took was both necessary and flawed, and the imperfection of his interventions haunted him more than any defeat. In the heat of combat, Guilliman glimpsed the paradox of godhood. He wielded immense power, yet that power could not guarantee the survival of what he had created. Even his triumphs contained the seeds of future terror. After the battle, Guilliman retreated to a high citadel overlooking the planet, his armor scorched, his mind burdened. The city below, though saved, bore the scars of what might have been a greater disaster. Guilliman contemplated the enormity of his responsibility, realizing that his role as a savior was inseparable from the fear it invoked. He had preserved humanity, yet the Imperium he safeguarded could collapse from forces he could not predict, from ambitions he could not suppress, and from the relentless march of entropy itself. He understood that his greatest adversary was not chaos, xenos, or rebellion, but the Imperium itself, a creation so vast and intricate that even its savior could scarcely comprehend it. The terror of this realization burned deeper than any battlefield, striking at the core of his being. As night fell over the citadel, Guilliman's thoughts turned to the consequences of eternity. The Imperium's survival depended on unending vigilance, on sacrifices that could never be counted, and on decisions that could never be perfect. He understood that his godhood was not liberating, it was a chain, binding him to endless responsibility and forcing him to confront the consequences of every action, every failure, every compromise. The fear that had haunted him since his return was no longer abstract, it was an inescapable truth. He had saved humanity, yet humanity's salvation was a double-edged blade, and even he might fall under its weight. The Imperium was both a testament to his brilliance and a mirror reflecting the limits of his power, and Guilliman realized that the dread of godhood was a price he could never lay down. In the quiet aftermath, Guilliman meditated on the paradox of leadership in a galaxy of unyielding extremes. He had returned as a hero, yet he was haunted by the realization that the Imperium's existence required fear, coercion, and moral compromise at every level. His victories, while monumental, were temporary shelters against a tide of entropy and human weakness. The weight of understanding that even the strongest, wisest Primarch could not command every thread of the Imperium's destiny pressed upon him like the coldest void. Every decision, every act of guidance was both salvation and potential damnation. The terror that gripped Guilliman was not the terror of death, but of responsibility unending, of godhood applied to a creation capable of surpassing even its savior's comprehension. and as the stars burned silently beyond the citadel walls, he understood with unflinching clarity. To save the Imperium was to fear it, and to fear it was the truest mark of its power.
The distant roar of artillery echoed across the scarred landscape as Guilliman stepped onto the bridge of his flagship, his gaze fixed on the war-torn world below. Smoke and fire clawed at the horizon, painting the planet in hues of crimson and ash. Fleets of Imperial warships, battered and limping, orbited in tense formation, their engines straining against the void. Guilliman's mind raced, calculating trajectories, assessing the strength of enemy formations, and anticipating the unpredictable moves of both mortal commanders and forces that defied reason. Yet even amidst the precision of strategy, he felt a creeping dread. The Imperium's vast machinery was unraveling faster than his calculations could predict. Orders were being ignored, fleets moved independently of command, and whispers of rebellion grew louder with each passing moment. The edge of despair was no longer a distant threat. It was here, tangible, pressing against him as tightly as the ceramite of his armor. Every action he took now risked escalating catastrophe, every pause a possible death sentence for millions. Ground reports streamed in, detailing the plight of loyalist soldiers entrenched in cities torn apart by Xenos incursions and human insurgents alike. Guilliman observed the chaos on holographic displays, noting the bravery of individuals caught in impossible circumstances. The Imperium's defenders fought with determination, yet their coordination faltered under the weight of attrition and the unpredictability of human nature. Guilliman knew that each soldier's courage, though heroic, was a fragile thread in a tapestry of destruction, one misstep away from unraveling entirely. The knowledge struck him with a bitter clarity. No amount of tactical brilliance could entirely compensate for the failings of an empire spread across a galaxy of billions. His victories on the battlefield now felt transient, ephemeral, and the weight of ensuring survival grew heavier with every passing hour. Suddenly, an alert screamed across the bridge. A chaos fleet had emerged from a warp rift near a strategically critical system. Guilliman's eyes narrowed as he assessed the threat, calculating engagement strategies in real time. Every maneuver had consequences. Every decision could save worlds or doom them. As he gave the orders to intercept, he felt the unyielding tension of command, the knowledge that even the smallest miscalculation could result in wholesale annihilation. The Imperium was resilient, yes, but fragile in ways that no amount of heroism could correct. The fleet moved into position, engines flaring against the black void, while Guilliman's mind replayed the grim calculations of possible losses, each scenario more horrifying than the last. This was not a war of glory, it was a war of survival, and even victory was tainted by the cost it demanded. On the surface, loyalist forces engaged in brutal, unrelenting combat. Guilliman watched through augmented sensors as soldiers fought amidst collapsing structures, civilians trapped in the crossfire, and insurgents exploiting every weakness. He could feel the desperation in their movements, the unspoken fear that pervaded even the most disciplined units. In the midst of this chaos, Guilliman was forced to make impossible choices: which sectors to reinforce, which cities to abandon, which lives could be spared, and which must be sacrificed for the greater strategy. Every decision gnawed at him, leaving invisible scars deeper than any wound inflicted by enemy fire. The weight of command was absolute, and the terror he felt was not for himself, but for the countless lives that hung in the balance of his judgment.
Amid the maelstrom, reports of internal treachery surfaced. Certain planetary governors had withheld forces, diverted resources, or secretly aligned with enemy agents. Guilliman's heart hardened as he realized that the Imperium's enemies were no longer solely outside its borders. They were within, thriving on indecision and exploiting human weakness. The edge of despair was now sharpened by betrayal, a reminder that even as he fought with precision and determination, unseen hands could undo every success. His strategic mind worked feverishly to counteract the sabotage, redirect loyalist forces, and stabilize critical sectors. Yet each correction revealed another flaw, another hidden threat. Guilliman's fear was no longer abstract, it was immediate, a tangible presence that pressed on him like the void itself, cold and unyielding. During a brief lull, Guilliman retreated to a command balcony overlooking the battlefield. Fires consumed entire districts, their smoke spiraling into the sky in black plumes, while the distant sounds of conflict never ceased. He observed the human cost. Soldiers who had once been proud defenders, now reduced to desperate survivors. Civilians scavenging amidst the wreckage, and leaders who clung to authority at the expense of reason. Every act of heroism was shadowed by tragedy, every tactical success shadowed by hidden failure. Guilliman understood with grim clarity that the Imperium's survival was a constant balance between order and chaos, and that he, despite his godlike abilities, could only intervene so much. The despair that surrounded him was not a fleeting sensation, it was the pulse of the galaxy itself, a living, breathing testament to the impossibility of complete control. Suddenly, a new crisis emerged. A warp rift opened near a populated sector, unleashing demonic entities that tore through defenses with relentless ferocity. Guilliman acted immediately, deploying fleets and orbital bombardments to contain the incursion, but even the combined might of loyalist forces struggled against the supernatural onslaught. Civilians were evacuated where possible, yet entire cities were consumed before reinforcements could arrive. Guilliman's mind raced through contingency plans, but each action revealed further complications, supply lines disrupted, reinforcements delayed, and coordination fractured. In that moment, the edge of despair became physical, a suffocating reality pressing down on him. He realized that no Primarch, no matter how brilliant, could fully control a galaxy this vast, with enemies both mortal and immortal, and with human flaws woven into every system. Amid the chaos, Guilliman confronted the moral paradox that had haunted him since his return. To save humanity, he must act decisively, yet every decision would cost lives. He ordered orbital strikes to halt enemy advances, knowing that civilian casualties were inevitable. The soldiers under his command executed these orders with precision, yet the horror of the results weighed upon him as heavily as the destruction he sought to prevent. Every life lost was a testament to the impossibility of perfection in command. Every victory a reminder that survival demanded compromise. The Imperium was a machine of contradictions, capable of sustaining itself while simultaneously threatening annihilation, and Guilliman's role as its savior was inseparable from the constant terror it inspired. As the battle reached its zenith, Guilliman's forces engaged the Chaos Fleet in brutal combat. Explosions rocked space, debris drifted like lethal clouds, and the screams of dying soldiers echoed across communication channels. Even as victory became possible, the Imperium's fragility was exposed. Supply lines faltered, loyalist commanders faltered under pressure, and insurgent activity increased on worlds that should have been secure. Guilliman realized that even when triumph was achieved, it would be fleeting, overshadowed by the knowledge that the galaxy was a tinderbox ready to ignite at the smallest spark. His terror was not the terror of defeat, it was the terror of understanding that the Imperium, vast and eternal, was a force that even he could not fully guide or protect. By nightfall, the battlefield quieted, though the smoke and flames persisted. Guilliman surveyed the results. Countless lives saved, but at a cost that seemed insurmountable. Every victory had a shadow, every moment of calm a prelude to further chaos.
The edge of despair had been sharpened by both external and internal threats, and the Primarch understood that the war for humanity's survival was not fought on battlefields alone. The Imperium itself, in its sprawling complexity, was both weapon and adversary, and the responsibility of guiding it was a burden heavier than any weapon he had ever wielded. Guilliman's gaze lingered on the horizon, and in that moment he understood the terrifying truth. Salvation was only temporary, and even the greatest hero could not escape the consequences of what he had saved.
Guilliman stood atop the bridge of his flagship, gazing down at the sprawling cities of Terra beneath him. From this height, the Imperium appeared magnificent, a vast network of light and order stretching across continents and oceans. Yet even in its grandeur, Guilliman sensed the fragility that lurked beneath. Fires from distant skirmishes still burned faintly in the industrial sectors, and the faint glow of corrupted systems hinted at the ever-present shadow of rebellion and heresy. Every world he had saved, every fleet he had commanded, every life he had spared or lost, coalesced into a single inescapable truth. The Imperium was not a kingdom he controlled, but a force that existed beyond comprehension, unpredictable and unyielding. The terror that had accompanied him through centuries of war now settled over him like a suffocating shroud, for he understood that the empire he had saved might one day turn against him, not in overt defiance, but simply in the inexorable logic of its own survival. Reports of unrest reached him even in this moment of reflective stillness. Planetary governors defying directives, fleets disappearing without trace, and whispers of secret cults gaining footholds in sectors supposedly secure. Guilliman's mind catalogued each event with meticulous precision, calculating risks, probabilities, and responses, yet he knew that no amount of planning could account for the myriad forces operating within the Imperium. Its complexity, its sheer scale, had become a double-edged sword, sustaining life and civilization while simultaneously sowing the seeds of chaos. He had returned to restore order, to save humanity from annihilation, yet in doing so, he had become bound to an empire whose depth and intricacy could terrify even a Primarch. The fear he felt was not merely personal, it was existential. The awareness that the survival of the Imperium did not guarantee the survival of its savior's purpose or conscience. Descending to the streets, Guilliman witnessed the consequences of centuries of conflict and reconstruction firsthand. Citizens moved through the ruins with resilience born of desperation, their faith and devotion tempered by trauma and fear. Soldiers guarded fractured sectors, ever vigilant, yet the signs of strain were unmistakable. Hesitation in command, reluctance in execution, and subtle gestures that suggested doubt, not defiance, but the fragile line between loyalty and self-preservation. Guilliman saw in their eyes the same terror that gnawed at his own mind, a mirror reflecting the weight of responsibility that even a godlike figure could not fully bear. Every action he had taken, every world he had saved, had come at the cost of fear, suffering, and moral compromise. Salvation, he realized, was never pure. It was inseparable from the shadows that trailed behind it. The Imperium's enemies were patient, and Guilliman's attention was drawn to a sudden surge of activity along the border of a neighboring system. Heretic forces, long thought contained, had found weakness in both the defenses and the resolve of imperial governors. The battle that followed was fierce, brutal, and close, yet even in victory, Guilliman felt the sting of futility. Cities were lost and regained, fleets destroyed and rebuilt, and the moral burden of every life sacrificed pressed upon him like a physical weight. The Imperium could endure, but it could never be perfect, and its flaws were now inseparable from the achievements he had wrought. Every triumph was tempered by the cost, every act of heroism shadowed by despair, and Guilliman understood that the edge of terror was not only a battlefield reality, but a permanent companion in the stewardship of an empire. In a quiet moment after the battle, Guilliman returned to the observation deck overlooking Terra, contemplating the paradox that had defined his existence since his return. The Imperium's citizens worshipped blindly, fleets obeyed commands without hesitation, yet beneath this surface of obedience lurked the unpredictable, uncontrollable forces of ambition, fear, and corruption. Guilliman reflected on the countless decisions he had made, each one necessary, each one flawed, and each one a potential trigger for disaster. He realized with clarity that the Imperium's survival depended not solely on power or strategy, but on constant vigilance, moral calculation, and an acceptance of imperfection. The weight of this realization was immense, a force that pressed against him as tangibly as any battlefield assault. To be a savior was not to triumph unambiguously. It was to endure, to persist, and to confront the fear that the empire he had preserved might one day undo him. Even as night fell over the planet, Guilliman's vigilance never wavered. Shadowy figures moved within the corridors of power, conspiring subtly yet effectively against those who sought stability. Whispers of rebellion and betrayal persisted, carried in coded messages and private councils. Guilliman understood that the Imperium's strength was inseparable from its fragility, that its order was dependent on fear as much as devotion. Every victory he had achieved, every life spared, every system stabilized, was both testament to his brilliance and a reminder of the potential for collapse. The terror he felt was the terror of knowledge, the awareness that the Imperium, in all its complexity, could turn against him not through overt force, but simply by following the inexorable patterns of its own imperatives. Salvation was never absolute. It was a delicate, terrifying balance of power, faith, and human flaw. Amid the quiet, Guilliman's thoughts turned inward to the personal cost of command. Centuries of leadership had hardened him, yet the emotional toll of responsibility weighed heavily. He reflected on the countless lives lost under his command, the decisions that had been necessary but morally fraught, and the endless cycle of destruction and reconstruction that defined his stewardship of the Imperium. Every victory was incomplete, every triumph a shadowed reflection of imperfection. Guilliman's fear was not born of weakness, it was born of understanding, of insight into the relentless, unforgiving nature of the empire he had saved. The Imperium existed because he had fought, because he had commanded, and because he had imposed order. Yet that very order carried the seeds of terror that haunted him still. Finally, Guilliman gazed outward to the stars, where countless fleets traversed the void, carrying humanity's fate with them. The galaxy was vast, infinite in its scope, and yet each system, each world was tethered to the fragile balance he maintained. The Imperium's survival was an ongoing act of creation and destruction, and Guilliman understood that the ultimate battle was not against external enemies, but against the unpredictable nature of the empire itself. The terror he felt, that gnawing dread that had accompanied him since his return, crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. To save the Imperium was to live in constant vigilance, to endure responsibility beyond comprehension, and to confront the terrifying realization that even its savior could not fully command it. Guilliman, the Primarch, the godlike protector, was not unafraid. He was terrified, not of enemies he could see, but of the Imperium itself, the creation he had nurtured and restored, and the inexorable reality that salvation carried a price no hero could ever fully pay.